Heartbreak at the Rio Grande River. A young migrant father and his daughter drowned while trying to cross from Mexico to the United States. How their story is impacting the debate on U.S. immigration reform. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Disturbing stories and poignant images emerged this week in the U.S. immigration crisis. Lawyers who visited border patrol stations across the United States state of Texas reported inhumane and unsanitary conditions for young children and mothers. Many of the unaccompanied children were said to be hungry, sick, and dirty. U.S. Customs and Border Protection say their facilities are overcrowded and could run out of funding by the end of the month. In response, the U.S. Congress just passed a border relief bill that includes funding for migrant children. And a disturbing story of a Salvadoran father and his daughter who drowned in the Rio Grande River brought into focus the harsh reality and the risks families are taking to reach the United States. U.S. President Donald Trump blamed party politics.
I hate it, and I know it could stop immediately if the Democrats change the law. They have to change the laws. And then that father, who probably was this wonderful guy with his daughter, things like that wouldn't happen, because that journey across that river is a very dangerous journey.
For more now on the U.S. immigration crisis, let's bring in our panel. Joining us here in the studio is Maria Perez. She's an Associate Director of the Atlantic Council's Latin America Center. Also with us is Rafael Bernal. He's a staff writer with the U.S. political newspaper The Hill. And from Pennsylvania, Michael Johns is the co-founder and national leader of the U.S. Tea Party movement. Welcome to all of you to the show. Maria, let me start with you. This immigration crisis seems to get worse as the days go by, and as we've just said, we saw those pictures of the father and his daughter who drowned trying to cross the Rio Grande River. Looking at all these tragic circumstances that we've seen over the past few days, do you think that will impact the immigration debate in any way?
Well, the electoral campaign is coming up season. We have the debate yesterday, the second Democratic debate tonight. It's a bigger problem. The recent moves by the Trump administration to cut funds to Central America are just going to exacerbate this crisis that we're having. It's more than just an immigration debate here in the United States. It's a regional problem. Mexico, the United States, and the three Northern Triangle countries need to work together to address this problem of immigration.
Now, the president has walked back some of that, part of that threat to cut funding to Central American countries. In fact, there will be something just over $400 million that will be going to those countries. Will that help in any way?
As part of the bill that just passed this afternoon, because last week they made good on their promise to cut the funding for Central America for the fiscal year 2018-2017. So there's more than $500 million that won't be dispersed, that were obligated to these countries, and they won't be dispersed anymore.
Rafael, Maria says this is a regional problem, so it would have to involve the countries in the region. There'd have to be something, I guess, like 4 or 5 countries involved in this.
Well, at least those 3 key countries, the Northern Triangle countries plus Mexico, you see a majority of people coming to seek asylum in the United States are coming from Guatemala, Honduras, and to a lesser extent now El Salvador. El Salvador is sort of leveling off, maybe even starting to lessen the amount of people leaving that country. But you see a environmental crisis that's putting Guatemalans out of their country. And you see a political and security crisis that's putting Hondurans out of their country. And the Honduran state actually plays a role in that. Also the Honduran opposition, it's a political crisis on every front. And you see countries like Mexico and the United States doing relatively little to help these countries, say, help Guatemala fix their problem with coffee growers who are not growing coffee or not selling coffee and thus coming to the United States. The Honduran issue is a little bit more complicated, and the Salvadorans seem to be taking care of their own business for now.
Rafael, one other point. President Trump has threatened to deport up to 2,000 undocumented families. In fact, they've already been served with deportation orders. He then offered a 2-week reprieve. calling on Congress to act first. What's the status of that now?
Well, I mean, that is a very classical case of Trump creating a crisis and then backing down from that crisis, sort of solving the crisis he created himself. The first question was, and that might have been resolved with today's vote in Congress, was you're going to go arrest 200,000, or he said millions of families. That ICE has never had the capacity to do that, but where are you going to put them? Your detention centers are already overflowing. Now, today's money that Congress appropriated to fix those detention centers, fixed depending on who you ask, of course, it might give them the capacity to put more people in detention, but certainly not the capacity to generate these large raids that President Trump was talking about. And it all goes down to the same thing. Trump wants to force Congress to reduce the protections for asylees and asylum seekers in the United States, and he's been chipping away from different angles, and today's victory for him was a very big step in achieving that.
Michael Johns, how is this crisis going to be resolved? Right now, the Border Patrol people, U.S. officials, telling us that they actually don't have any more capacity for children at the border.
Well, they don't, although today's vote in the House is generally constructive. It will allocate about almost $3 billion more in medical care. The point I think that needs to be made, however, is there's all this discussion about the interests of Central Americans and what we can do to be more and more helpful, almost no discussion about the detrimental impact that illegal immigration is having on this country, the need that we have to secure the border, to have an orderly immigration policy placed into place. The president has it right there. And finally, on the purported ICE raids that did not take place, those were not randomly targeted. Those were against individuals who had received deportation orders from courts of law. And it's important to remember that we have to remain a country of a rule of law, or there'll be boundless illegal immigration into this country, no limits to it, and ultimately no resources available to sustain it.
Michael, I hear what you say.
We're at that point now, frankly.
Yeah, I hear what you say about legal and illegal migration, but many of the people who are turning up at the southern border are actually seeking asylum because they are escaping poverty, they're escaping violence, they're escaping the drug violence that we see in Central America.
But let's ask how they're faring in the courts when their amnesty cases are being heard. 90% of them are having their amnesty cases rejected. That's a quantifiable fact, and that's among the small percentage that are even showing up for those cases. So for the vast majority of these people are essentially economic immigrants. They're seeking a better way of life. No one blames them for that. I think most of us put in that position might be exactly where they are, trying to get into the United States, the greatest country in the world. But the point is that that is not in the American interest. We have to maintain a rule of law, and we have to maintain the integrity of our borders. We have not done that for well over 40 years now, and this president correctly is trying to get that done. Today, I think finally, in rejecting efforts to cut ICE funding and to put other provisions into this legislation of the House shows that Democrats are really beginning to run scared a bit on the issue and are afraid of the ramifications of being perceived as open border advocates in the 2020 legislative race.
So, Rafael, just one point, if you could clarify this for us. I mean, you also have legal qualifications. When someone turns up at the U.S. border and asks for asylum, what happens after that?
Well, the first thing that happens is they go to an interview that's known as a credible fear interview. And that's a very sort of surface level interview with the border agent, where the border agent asks basic questions. Are you afraid of going back to your home country? Why are you afraid? You know, if they say there's a lot of discussion about whether, say, family violence can proceed to an asylum case. That's sort of an illegal limbo. That's a debate, and the Trump administration says no, of course, but that one's debatable. But if you say, well, because I'm afraid of persecution by the Honduran state, for instance, well, that's passing the that first step. And then it goes into a much longer proceeding. Right. And here's a number that's very tricky that Michael used. Yes, about 90% of people who request asylum eventually don't get it. That's the number the administration and its supporters use. There's a number that the left uses, which is also a true number, that a similar number of people who have legal representation, who seek asylum cases, who are coming from Central America, eventually get it. So the big difference there is having a lawyer. So we don't really know if everybody had legal representation, what proportion of people would eventually get the asylum.
Well, they're afforded free representation.
Also, the Trump administration has moved to elevate the threshold in order to have a credible claim of a fear, in order to be able.
But those thresholds that you're talking about, they're stipulated in the law.
Yes, but in summer of 2018, now former Attorney General Sessions moved to elevate those thresholds. So it's now more difficult to show a fear of persecution, whether it's because of your sexual orientation or because you're being persecuted for your political beliefs, religious beliefs, whatever have you. Those thresholds have been elevated, and so it's more complicated to make the case that you have a credible fear.
Maria, President Trump, he did a pretty lengthy interview with the United States television network, NBC, this past week. He was asked about the treatment of children at the border. This is what he had to say. Let's watch this.
What's happened, though, are the cartels and all of these bad people, they're using the kids. It's almost like slavery.
Well, let's not punish the kids more.
This has been happening.
The kids are getting punished more.
You're right, and this has been happening long before I got there. What we've done is we've ended separation. You know, under President Obama, you had separation. I was the one that ended it. Now, I said one thing. When I ended it, I said, here's what's going to happen. More families are going to come up, and that's what's happened.
So there's something of a blame game going on here, Maria. I mean, do you see a plan here, a strategy?
A strategy on behalf of the Trump administration? Yeah. I don't see a strategy. Also, let us mention, I wanted to go back on something that Michael was saying, that we have to stop talking about Central Americans' interests. Addressing the Central American migration crisis is in direct relation with American interests. You cannot have an insecure border, insecure partners south of the border directly affect the United States and American interests. That is why this cut in foreign aid is so appalling, because every dollar that goes to these countries is to forward an American interest. So just. And it's not only the dollars that go in there; it's the conditionalities that are attached to this money that is in direct interest with the American people.
Right, Michael. Doesn't Maria make a valid point there that what's going on in Central America, what's going on at the border right now, as a result of what's going on in those countries in Central America, is of direct interest to the United States? You want a stable border. You want a stable southern flank there.
Well, we want a stable border. That starts with a border wall. And unfortunately, the precise people that have been making that argument haven't been making the argument for the border wall. As far as Central America, Latin America, and the world at whole go, we would like to see economies improving. We'd like to see an end to gang violence and violence of all sorts, threats of all sorts. We do more than our share, more than any country in the world in Central America, and have historically, to foster security and economic development in that region. And we continue to do that to the tune of billions of dollars. But ultimately, the American interest is not served if we're not getting reciprocity from Central American countries and working with us to contain this immigration problem. That was the president's
But you've just had reciprocity.
With the threat.
Yeah, you just had reciprocity. Mexico just agreed to deploy its National Guard to help with this crisis.
Right, but we still have a porous border on the southern Mexican border.
Right.
I mean, there is still nothing stopping Central American immigrants from entering into Mexico and ultimately the United States to stem this flow of immigration. And of course, that goes against the third-party component of amnesty provisions alone, that Central Americans, if they're seeking amnesty, are to apply for it in their first country of safe refuge. For most Central Americans, that's Mexico.
Mexico
is not a safe country. They shouldn't be in the United States.
Rafael, I just want to go to...
They would disagree with that, many would.
I just want to Sorry, you want to say something?
Well, I mean, we have never seen the Mexican state act in the way that it is acting now. The only parallel, maybe similar, is when Nixon closed the border to start the drug war,
Right.
which many would argue ultimately ended in what we're seeing today,
Right.
ironically. But the Mexican state is risking very much violating the human rights of its own citizens and of Central American and
Right.
world citizens in the actions that it's taken in agreement with the Trump administration. Now, of course, the Mexicans say it's an agreement that is convenient to them. There's been a lot of political criticism against them internally, but certainly Mexican armed forces, and President Trump agrees with this, are doing a lot to contain Central American migration.
Okay. Just one quick question I had for you, Rafael, and that is on what's been taking place at the U.S. Congress in the past few hours. That bill has been passed. It approves $4.6 billion emergency humanitarian aid. How is that money going to be used?
That money is mostly going to be used to augment the capabilities that Border Patrol and CBP have to house and feed and allow bathing and medical care of the migrants who are there, mostly. There is some money that's going to be used for enforcement measures, and that obviously became problematic within the Democratic caucus.
Maria, earlier I talked with an attorney who's been working at the border. Her name's Toby Gialluca. She recently visited a detention center at the McAllen center in Texas. I asked her about conditions at that Border Patrol facility. This is what she told me. Let's watch this.
The conditions were abhorrent. It became very clear very quickly upon our arrival that there was a widespread health crisis that was ongoing. There was a complete lack of basic sanitary practices, and as a result, the transmission of the flu had been rampant. And the condition of the detainees was just absolutely unbelievable. One of the pediatricians who visited described it as torture conditions.
Did the people there have access to facilities like showers and toilets and things like that?
Oh, no, they did not. They did not have access to running water. They did not have access to soap. They had access to the restrooms at the discretion of the guards. Very often the guards would just deny access for extended periods of time. They did not often shower. There were people who had been there for weeks who had not had a shower, who were wearing the same clothing that they crossed the border wearing. The children were wearing filthy clothes, inadequate clothing. Many of them didn't have pants, socks, shoes. A lot of them had had their clothing taken from them upon arrival and had been sent to sleep outside in the dirt at facilities they had visited prior to arriving in Ursula. The food situation was not adequate. The food provided to the adults was oftentimes frozen or rotten or inedible. Their food was not provided to toddlers. They were put back on infant formula and limited to 3 bottles a day. The water that they were given to mix that formula was unclean. So most of the mothers would try to utilize any bottled water they were able to obtain to mix formula for their children. Everyone was not receiving sufficient nourishment, and there was a lot of concern among the mothers about their children, their small children, losing weight at a rapid pace.
Right, and when you talk to the young mothers and children there, what do they say to you?
Oh, it's just devastating. I just can't fully articulate the scope of the suffering that they're enduring. They're in incredibly terrible conditions following an incredibly grueling journey. They're demoralized, they feel dehumanized, they're incredibly terrified about what's going to happen to their children, both immediately with regards to their health, because many of them were critically ill and in need of immediate medical attention, and they had been denied repeated requests for care for their children. So the mothers were, they were terrified and they were distraught.
There was one case that I saw about a 16-year-old mother who had an 8-month-old child.
Yes.
She had her child's clothing taken away from her. Her clothing was in a bag, and they took that away. Do you know why they did that, and what can you tell us about this family?
Yeah, what I can tell you about that is when that mother and her child arrived in the United States, they self-presented to Border Patrol, which is the case almost all of the time, and they were taken to a Border Patrol facility. At that time, the 8-month-old had a mild cold. Her mother's bag with extra clothing for the child, medicine, and milk was taken away. The child's clothing was taken away, and the guards told her that sleeping outside would be good for the baby. And they were sent to sleep outside in the dirt for 4 days before they were transferred to the Ursula station.
Did any of them tell you why they had made this journey to the United States? I mean, this is a perilous journey. It's a very hard journey for them to make. Did they tell you anything about conditions in their home countries?
Oh, they did. And the conditions are so beyond anything that we could truly understand. What we saw were primarily minor mothers with their small infant children, so 16, 17-year-old mothers with infants all the way up to 2.5 years old. The ones that I spoke to had undertaken this journey on their own. They had generally left in the middle of the night after being threatened directly by gang members, and they just took their children and what they could carry, and then they set out on what they knew would be a perilous journey in the hopes of saving their babies from God knows what violence.
That was attorney Toby Gialluca talking to me earlier. And Maria, there are some immigration rights activists who say, when you listen to stories like that this is being done deliberately to act as a deterrent.
I don't know what to say. I had a really hard time listening to this lawyer. I just imagine my 16-month-old daughter in these conditions. It's just appalling. I think you summarized it perfectly in your opening remarks. Heartbreaking. Yeah.
Michael, what did you make of what you heard there? And before you give me your answer, the speaker, the Democratic Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, she's likened what happens at the border to child abuse. This is what she said. Let's listen to her.
This situation is child abuse. It is an atrocity that violates every value we have, not only as Americans, but as moral beings. Today, sadly, our values are being undermined by the President's failed policies, which has intensified the situation of heartbreak and horror on the border, which challenges the conscience of America.
So, Michael, listening to what we've just heard there, what is your response?
Sadly, I think the real child abuse are those who would take their children through these perilous conditions, knowing what they face in summer heat without the resources to do it, all with the hope that we've, I think, falsely provided them that they're going to be assured safe haven in the United States. Our amnesty policies, as this president correctly pointed out, really need to be freshly looked at and revised so that we remain hospitable to legitimate seekers of amnesty, and we place proper restrictions on the literally tens of millions of people from all over the world who would come here if they were given the opportunity. I mean, we have 7 billion people in this world. It's been shown that literally hundreds of millions of people in the world would come here if they had the opportunity to come here. So it's not particularly shocking that people will go to such lengths to try to essentially circumvent our system, which provides a much safer way of going about it. Go to the U.S. Embassy, go to a U.S. consulate, and go through the application process. That process exists and is in place and can be done without placing children in these extraordinarily difficult and admittedly horrific conditions.
Rafael, is that an alternative? Go to the embassy?
I hate to be harsh, but that's a risible it just makes no sense. The process of obtaining a visa.
Not when 90% of these people are being denied amnesty in amnesty
we don't
courts.
actually know the
Perfect sense
number
if they do it.
of how many people with representation would ultimately get asylum.
They're all afforded representation.
And they're actually not afforded representation by the state. They are given pamphlets to seek out aid from NGOs and so on. Many of them don't understand the pamphlets. Many of the Guatemalans coming, for instance, their first language is Mayan, and that's been a problem. The Mexicans don't have enough translators, and they have an entire region.
These lawyers that are down there, the likes of which were just interviewed, are representing these
One moment,
individuals.
Michael, I'll get to you.
The really difficult part to swallow is the idea that anyone who's in a prospective asylum seeker could apply for a U.S. visa. I personally have a U.S. visa. I mean, I'm very proud of it. I was able to apply for it. It's expensive to maintain. It was hard to get, and it depended on getting an education in the United States.
You didn't apply for asylum, though.
I did not apply for asylum. I would not be eligible for asylum. But somebody who would be eligible for asylum is very unlikely to also have the circumstances or the skill sets or the provable, financials to be able. Now it can happen. Yeah. But to be able to apply for asylum, there's not much overlap in that Venn diagram. Put it that way.
Very quickly, Michael, I've got about a minute. What do you make of that? It's not that easy just walking to the United States Embassy or the United States Consulate and making these applications.
The process exists, and it's worked for many millions. 1 million people of the world are brought in here every year under our legal immigration processes. Some would like to see that even increased. So there is a process in place that's working for these people.
But we're talking about asylum seekers,
Right, and what I'm saying is that process has worked for many millions of asylum seekers that are now in the United States who have followed that process and done so without having to go through the extraordinary and potentially even deadly circumstances of bringing children through a 1,000-mile-plus journey in the middle of the summer heat.
Rafael, very quickly, just got a few seconds left. A lawsuit has been filed in the U.S. District Court in California against the U.S. government over its treatment of children at the border. What is that lawsuit seeking? What does it want to do?
I'm not familiar with what lawsuit you're talking about, but generally they're seeking, activists in general are seeking to force the border agencies and border protection agencies to have limitations in how they can treat children. And that's what's missing from today's bill, which is why the left is so enraged that this bill passed.
The left and the Democratic Party.
Yes.
Okay, we are going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.